We'll come back to that if anybody's interested, if there are any librarians in the audience. But there's also a problem with the way that we've responded, which is us, I mean librarians, museum curators, public broadcasters, university teachers. We've not really been very good at getting into this. Here's the sad story of Edward Castronova. He built a virtual world called Arden in order to encourage people to engage with the world of Shakespeare. So it was like a kind of second life. And you could walk through Shakespeare's London, you could go and have a drink with Falstaff and so on. But it was a total failure, and he's now closed it down. And he's very honest about it. He says this: we put Arden in front of Shakespeare experts and they loved it. We put it in front of playtesters and they yawned. We failed to design a gripping experience. So he's now designing something called Arden 2. In Arden 2, we are not trying to put Shakespeare in front of anyone. We are making a game, monsters everywhere. What they told him was that if you want a good game, you've got to have monsters, and there weren't any monsters in the Shakespeare world, and weren't any aliens or anything, but something you could zap. So he's now abandoned Shakespeare, although he's a Shakespeare scholar, and he's just making a game instead. That's a tragic retreat, because my own view is that this is the moment in time where, as people working in public institutions need to retrieve the possibility of building a public cultural commons that would not be subject to commercialisation, but would offer people something different, would offer them an alternative way of using the internet, which was not full of advertising, not full of pop-ups, but full of real quality material. And there are really interesting possibilities. If you think about what's happening to public cultural institutions now, first of all, they're liberated from this question of place. Not just broadcasting, but everywhere. Museums, libraries are all online now. They're liberated from the constraints of time. They become something else. Broadcasting is a very good example. If you watched a program, it was an event in time. You watched it and then it was gone. Then we got video and you could watch it again or you could watch it later, but it was still an event. You sat down and watched it. What I would argue is happening now is that they're not events, they're gateways. So if you go to the BBC website, you'll see that there's a huge amount of material associated with the programme. So if you watch the programme, it's a first step into a whole series of resources that you can access. And many people actually spend more time on the web than they do watching the programmes. In fact, the BBC website is hugely popular. It's among people who've never watched any BBC programmes, but they access the material on the web. But there's something else that's really important, which is that we're beginning to see a new relationship between the kind of professional expertise and popular participation. One of the really interesting examples is this one that's running on the BBC now, History of the World. I want to use this as an example of two things. First of all, it's a collaboration between the BBC and the British Museum. So you've got two public institutions working together. The first precondition for a digital commons would be that we network public institutions, that we find a way of joining them together to maximising what each of them contributes. Now you might say, well, that's a classic top-down thing. Here you have exhibits from the British Museum that the BBC is running little programmes about. That's pretty paternalistic, pretty kind of standard. Except that something else is going on. People are being encouraged to bring in objects into their local museums. The city I live in is 46% non-Anglo. And people have been flooding into my local museum with objects that tell the story of migration, tell the story of dispossession, tell the story of exploitation. And those are also being archived and put on the web. So it's not just the professional collection, it's actually everyday objects, everyday histories, everyday experience. I think that's a tremendously exciting thing. And you see all over public institutions, everybody has a blog now. All the kind of key people have blogs. This is Mark Commode, who's the film critic. It's extremely lively. People participate, they argue with him, they shout at him. So that kind of critique that public institutions were too paternalistic, too top-down, is gradually fading away, that there's a much more collaborative mood. And I think that's what I would want to defend. I'd want to defend a public commons which combines the history of public goods with the new gift relationships, but does it outside of the orbit of commerce and offers people something which is genuinely different and genuinely interesting. But we have to, if we're going to do that, we have to be careful not to do an Edward Castronova. We have to design things that will be engaging, that will be exciting, that won't just be worthy, but will be genuinely pleasurable. And I think we've got some way to go in developing that. But now is the time. If we don't do it now, it will be gone. And there will only be Google. If the internet ends up colonized by a handful of companies, and one of the economic tendencies that's been very marked is that a tendency towards monopoly. So you will have a dominant search engine, you will have a dominant eBay, you will have a dominant Amazon. There's very little effective competition now. So you end up with a very concentrated cluster of power. If the internet only becomes that, then we will have wasted one of the great opportunities for changing communication that we've had for a very long time. But my argument is that you can only do that if you commit yourself to an alternative way of organising not just public contributions, but popular contributions. And if you think that's unrealistic, one of the most used sites on the internet in UK is a site for people tracing their family histories. History is a very interesting example. People are passionately interested in finding out where they came from, finding out who they are, finding out who their grandparents were, finding out what their ancestors did in the 18th century. You can use that and you can bring it into a wider sphere. And that's, I think, what we need to commit ourselves to do. If we don't do that, I think we will be blamed by future generations for having squandered an enormous opportunity. And it's an exciting project. And I think it can be done, and I think it is being done, but it needs to be defended. I come from a society where we have a long tradition of public investment in these kinds of activities. But even now, the BBC is proposing to cut 25% of its website as a concession to the market argument. We have to fight for the preservation of a commons and to resist enclosure. Okay.